Hello? So I went and watched a play today, which was playing in my town. It is And Juliet. The premise is that after the story of Romeo and Juliet, Juliet didn't actually die. Now she's alive and running around. And this is going to be spoilerific. It's not exactly a review, it's just some of the thoughts I had after watching it. But it's a very forward pushing, super liberal girl power, gay power, all that jazz bit there. So that's sort of the outlook we're dealing with, right? And as I'm watching it, I'm thinking, well, it's a interesting premise. Let's see how it goes. And it starts up, and Juliet does her introduction, and there is Shakespeare and his wife, Anne Hathaway, doing their bit, and we kind of understand what's happening here and so on. Then it jars off that area by all of a sudden having, like, it introduces somebody named May, and what happens is Anne Hathaway, lectures Shakespeare because May was misgendered, I think, or, was assumed to be a certain gender, and she's, and the Anne Hathaway acts as the the lecturing voice, the voice who says to a room full of people, to the entire audience, don't assume gender or sexual orientation or anything like that. What it happened is it feels very off, right? That moment feels very off because it's so blunt, right? We're entering into a story, and there are characters, and they're doing something, and then all of a sudden there's something from our modern world just shouted out, and it's very loud, it's like a command. And whenever I run across bits like that, which are preachy, right, the method that it comes across is preachy, I always think, well, that must be the wrong way to go about it, right? You're in a play, and you're breaking the general rule of how a good story is told. Don't tell, show. Show, don't tell. Show, don't tell. So if May is of an orientation of one way or another, then if this is assumed to be a problem, how do you demonstrate in the world of the story that it is a problem that needs to be overcome? This is a problem which needs to have commentary upon it. You create little stories, right? You create interactions where people say snide remarks, or May runs into a problem. And there is a little bit of an attempt to do that, but it's a very light touch, right? There's one little moment where something over a bathroom, and the attendant says, "Sir," and it's meant to be insulting, and May's I'll put by this, but then it is left behind. And there's another bit where May kisses a guy, and there's a song playing, I kissed a girl and I liked it, and it plays I kissed a boy and I liked it. So now we are supposed to assume that May is a boy, right? The story structure is lost and it's loose, and it's not treated as an issue in the play. Right, even the kid who comes out is gay. His father is immediately like, "Oh yeah, let's cry, and it's great." And we're like, "Well, why was the kid worried in the first place?" Right? There's no main character who goes through an evolution. This isn't a story with people in it. It's more like, in this aspect of it at least, it's more like watching figurines move around. They aren't entirely real people here, and this isn't a real issue. It's so how do you have an issue like that, like a social issue, no matter what it is. It can be, it could be a gender, or it can be a religion, for or against one view or another. And how do you come across as not preachy, as not lecturing? How do you come across, instead of just saying, well, it should be this way, or it should not be that way, right? Which is, frankly, it's an insulting manner, right? It reads as insulting because it says to the watcher or the reader or the listener that they aren't capable of understanding the situation, right? It's what happens when I have to, explain something to myself as if I, explain like I was 4, sort of bit. When I have to be very obvious and close, and, adults don't always take that very well. So that's part of the, show, don't tell. And the other bit where I see that as an issue is just as regards actual storytelling. You can bring in bits and pieces from the outside. You can assume a structure. Juliet has 2 parents, for example. That is assumed. They go to a club, and there's a bouncer who stops them from entering. And that is a social structure, social moment, which is assumed and obvious, and that everybody knows what's going on. But, if you enter into the same situation, you say, we are going to the club, and the bouncer will stop us. It is his job to stop us from going in the club. Then you end up dumbing down the story, is what it feels like. And this is fine when you are reading a book in 1st grade or 2nd grade, even 4th or 5th grade sometimes. But as we continue on, it becomes more and more of a blunt instrument. And being a blunt instrument, it is ineffective. Like the feeling is that if I am standing up there lecturing you, that I'm not speaking to the choir. And if I am not speaking to the choir, the people who are already with me and on my side and believe me and all that, then I should not be lecturing, I should be persuading. So what is the point of standing up in a play like this and having a lecture moment towards the audience? Having a moment where they say, you should unassume gender or orientation or anything of that sort. It's just, it was very off place. It seemed like the sort of bit that's put in by someone who has to put out their own personal views, right? It's a personal viewpoint, in that it is a story. It is a lecture point which would arise during a personal interaction, right, between 2 people. And in the play, there is an attempt to create this by, Anne talking to Shakespeare. But, well, first of all, it doesn't jive exactly with the Anne we begin with, who is mostly concerned with, I would say, like girl power, with feeling left behind, with feeling ignored by Shakespeare, with feeling that she is not important or not powerful. And so, her character is distinct from this gender fluid character and bit. And it is forced in. It's a problem. And this is something that I see in quite a lot of pieces. I can read it sometimes in philosophical articles, or in TV. I see it in TV shows. I see it by sometimes just during talk shows or radio. Well, not radio shows. I haven't really said it, but maybe a YouTube video once in a while, or a movie or film, for example. They'll throw in a social message, and it's very strong and vibrant and obvious what their social message is, but that social message also stands apart from much of the rest of the situation, right? It's like they could not figure out how to show, not tell, so they just tell. And you could take out that statement or that moment from the entire piece and still present the issue without changing anything. So, the message, the idea would still get across. So I always have trouble with, artistically speaking, why you have lecture moments in, artistic areas, right? It's just artistically, it seems off to me. It's always off-putting, and I feel like I'm taken out of the story for a bit. Okay, and one of the reasons I feel like I'm taken out of the story for a bit is because what a lecturing moment like that does is say that we support an alternative lifestyle, okay? And by labeling a lifestyle as alternative, you label a different lifestyle as normal. And there are different modes of thought about this, but for me, probably because I've never been in the middle of a moment where, like, my personal identity has been threatened, so my reaction to the idea of that is much less visceral and immediate. Maybe part of the issue. But also, I would say something like a lecturing moment like this, a moment where you say a certain lifestyle or a character is alternative and different and must be therefore treated special. Yeah, and they're treated special because you mark them out as special and different, because you dedicate an entire moment not to showing who they are, but to telling the audience who they are and how they should treat them because of that. What you are doing, you're attempting to enforce a social norm by unsocial means. You're attempting to enforce a rule by shouting at the top of your lungs instead of forming a line, instead of showing up every day, instead of talking to someone as they prefer to be talked to. It's part of the issue is it seems performative. And even if it's not performative in the minds of those people, it acts in such a way. Like the message is, I need to stand up and make a speech about how our society is wrong in such and such a way. And then after this short intermission, we'll get back to the story. And I generally wonder how effective that is. How does it doesn't feel as if that would change anybody's mind, right? Who has a different viewpoint. It doesn't feel as if it makes an, quote unquote alternative lifestyle comfortable to be in. It just seems that it is somewhat pointless to have a large, strident view and make lots of noise and lecturing. If I'm going to say, such and such is wrong, then I'm going to give examples of why it is wrong. I'm going to show, like, this person is hurt, that person is hurt, this person is hurt. This is illogical, that doesn't make sense. This person who criticizes it is hypocritical because they did this. This other viewpoint is based upon this other viewpoint, which is based upon this other viewpoint, which we disagree with. So if you follow the chain of reasoning, then you should disagree with the last viewpoint, which I'm criticizing right now. I guess I prefer to take my time. I mean, even the fact that I'm sitting here, I'm talking at a camera. I'm talking with myself, rolling it around, going, okay, how do I learn from this? Like what message do I take? Okay. So if I have, for example, a friend who comes out as different in some way, a friend who decides to change genders, or a friend who decides to embrace his Black heritage, or a friend who learns that they're 1/4 Cherokee, or a friend who learns that they're adopted, all these different bits and pieces where they've decided that they are something different, or they want to investigate some different aspect of themselves, or put forward a different aspect of themselves and stop hiding something, or even just trying out like that, right? Like, if your friend shows up one day wearing a dress and you're like, okay, Fred, what's going on here? Right? You are inclined to stand there and go, this is different. Let me ask a question. But at the same time, if Fred is like, I don't want to talk about it, or Fred is like, hey, talk to me for 2 or 3 minutes about this idea, and then let's move on to playing League of Legends again. Or if, I don't know, Sarah comes in and she's obviously growing a mustache. Or if your friend who has always straightened her hair comes in one day and it's all afro-like, and you're going, okay, I've known you for 8 years. You straighten your hair every day for 8 years. Now it's all afro and, go Africa bit. Like, obviously something has changed, and how much should I acknowledge that change? How should I deal with that change? I mean, my reaction, of course, is to go, okay, if they want to talk about it, then they'll bring it up. But the way in which I interact with them should not change whatsoever from how I interacted with them before. Because they're the same person. Whatever aspect of personality they're putting out, if it doesn't change, whether they are good or bad, it doesn't turn them evil, then it's not something that I feel I should interact with as special, because the other thing they would not have been special either. And of course I'm going to end up having thoughts maybe and going over it in my head, but that still, it seems to me, shouldn't change the interaction, right? So my movement is more passive, right? My reaction is more, as long as it doesn't affect me directly in some harmful fashion, then it is unimportant. And yet you run into these lecturing moments quite often where one side will say, well, this is good and this is bad and that is bad and this is good. And they all have their reasons, and some of them are very, very angry about those reasons. And my reaction is always the same. Okay, calm down. Nobody's died right this moment. Let's figure out what's going on. And, I'm going to come to my own personal opinions, act my own personal way. You're going to do the same thing. But we can still have a conversation here. And lecturing moments, to me, get in the way of that conversation, because it is taking a stance in such a way that you're saying, well, this is right and this is moral, and there is no discussion to be had. And if you're against me, then you must be evil. And I'm going, okay, people are complicated. And people take time to change their mind. And, if I'm interacting with somebody and they decide to change who they are, then I expect this to be a long, slow, drawn-out process. People don't change in a day. They change in months and years. Except, of course, if they're having a sort of mental crisis and it all comes exploding out at once. And then you're in a different situation, right? Where you're just trying to get them back to center, their own emotional center. And you're in crisis mode and panic mode. But you can't be in crisis mode and panic mode all the time either. I've had friends who have been, suicidal, and I'll call them on the phone, talk to them, but at the end of the day, it's a bit of a question, like, how much do I push for this? Obviously, I've tried to engage with them and they don't really want to talk to it, but you're there, you call, you interact once in a while, you see how they're doing, you check to see if they're still alive, I haven't talked to you in 6 months, you send them a text, sort of thing, for the ones aren't doing well. But if they are, drawing away, if they've obviously decided that they want to find other friends, or they've decided to change something about themselves and then move on and leave their old life behind, then, like, what can I do about that? It's their decision. I come from a philosophical viewpoint and culture and history where it's very much, personal decisions are your responsibility. Your personal life is the way you want to live your life, and why would I criticize it if it doesn't affect me in some harsh fashion? I'm going to stand in the way of what I think is bad, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to lecture, because it doesn't feel like lecturing. If someone else is lecturing me, that is effective. So why would I attempt to do the same thing to someone else? Right? Like, so I'm here in a camera and I'm talking about various ideas, but these are my ideas and the way I deal with it. And I'm mostly talking to myself, even though I'll eventually, if I work up the willpower, put this online somewhere. But it's about personal viewpoints and interactions. So again, we come back to this feeling you have, when someone stands up and says, right? And they're very much critical of a viewpoint which I know exists, but which I do not hold myself. Then at what point or to what level am I going to support them, right? My tendency, naturally, is to support rather silently, is to answer a question if asked, is to moderate my own actions and choices, to be aware of social problems and keep an eye out for moments where this might become an issue. Sometimes I'll see myself acting in such a way or assuming certain things about other people, and if I recognize that, then I'll work back, or I'll say sorry. But it's a very personal activity which reflects in my artistic work as well, right? Like I don't want to lecture people. When I do this, or when I write down a poem, or when I do an essay, that I'm talking, or I find that I do much better if I imagine I'm talking to a specific person, right? Like as I speak this right now, there's a TV screen turned off in front of me where I can see my own reflection. So I'm literally talking to myself. When I write a poem, I'm talking to a specific person. It's very one-on-one interaction. And, there are limitations to that, which is why I'm speaking to a camera on a microphone, because I've talked to myself for 30 years and I'm really, really tired of only doing that. So I'm taking baby steps and talking to the world by talking to myself and expecting some sort of response, hopefully. Because I've said most of what I want to say to myself already. Even as I go through this bit here, I'm repeating myself again. Okay. So as for the... Okay, and then I wrote, an activist versus a pacifist artistic working. So I'm generally a pacifist in my artistic workings. I put up a piece, I have a link somewhere to it. I say, here it is. If you like it, look at it. If you don't like it, ignore it. I'm not going to be out here, pulling ads and saying, well, it means such and such and deep a thing, and people should be concerned with that because and so on and so on. So I'm like, I'm me, and here you don't have to watch anything I'm saying if you don't want to. You don't have to listen to anything I'm saying. I'm not pushing it on you. I'm not lecturing. I'm just talking to a camera, and you can ignore that. But there's another way of responding to the world where you see injustices and you see problems, and you stand up and you post about this happening and that happening and that happening, and you call out people, by name sometimes, by taking them or in person or in your writing, in your publishing, and say, well, this person did something bad, or these people did something wrong, or people who believe like this, or people who act like that are doing bad, and I want to bring that out into the open. And that's a different way of personally interacting with the world, which I tend to find slightly uncomfortable. I'm not a I'm not a confrontation in person sort of guy. There's a reason I'm talking to a camera and not in the middle of town square, standing on a soapbox. But, if you're writing a play, you also have the thought process of dealing with that. How do I make a comment on the world we live in by doing some sort of artistic working? If you're doing a play like this one, and you want to have a message in that play, you want the play to say something, then how do you get that across? If you want the play to change the world in some way, to change at least one person's mind out there, how do you do that? And, I don't feel that lecturing works very well. I feel it showing works very well. If people are hated because of what they do or how they act or what they call themselves, then how do you make them not be hated? Well, you show that they are human too. You bring in empathy. You bring in history. You can bring in logic and emotion. You try to mix all these together without standing on one side of a fence or standing up on a tower and shouting out rules and laws and how things should be with, your upraised fist and a bottle of, I don't know, something ready for a Molotov cocktail in the other hand, saying, I'm going to burn the world down, we should be angry about this. And how do you convince people who are not angry about this? You can do it in one of two ways, I feel. One way is to be yourself, right? To say, I am angry about this. I feel this way about this. This affects me, and so I have such and such an opinion on that. And if you do this, then you are bringing your humanity to the fore and hoping that others will see your own humanity and then connect with you in that way, right? If I can explain my logic, then someone who disagrees with me can say, I disagree with you, but I see your point. I see how you might believe that. Even if my logic isn't as strong, even if they're not looking at me logically, if I can say, I feel this because of my history, because what has happened to me, then they can connect with that and, hopefully, and be like, okay, I understand why you believe this way. I understand what you think. And, maybe they disagree using logic, or maybe they say, well, my history says the opposite to me. But, that's it, trying to be personal. The other way, imagine that you can have a message in a play that you can have a message in a artistic manner, is to say something where the point is not the artist, but the art. Right, where you remove your own self and your own ideas and history and logic completely from a piece and try to have the piece speak for itself. A poem which is attributed anonymously, for example, might sometimes do this. Or an abstract art piece might do this. Or a mural might do this, where you're passing by and it is, I want to say, some physical artwork where you understand, you see something, but you don't know who wrote it. You don't know who created it, right? You don't think immediately, well, that's a black writer. Well, that's a white writer. Well, that is a female writer. That's a male writer. Well, that's an Indian writer. And there are times and places for that personal effect, but such a personal effect can also sometimes get in the way, because I feel that people can see situations where I say something like, I am me and I believe this. And then the person watching this reacts and says, well, that's okay for you, but I am me and I believe this other thing. Right. And if I don't manage to connect with them, like if they say, well, I understand you have issues because of your race or your ideology, but for my part, I don't see those problems, or I think that those problems arise from a different source than where you believe they do. right? And so I'm not connecting with you because even if I feel sorry for you, I don't believe you. And that can get in the way. Whereas a pure piece where you remove any hint even of who the artist is or where they come from can also say something about a situation, but it does it differently. And I feel like that's much harder to pull off. We are very inclined to be personal people. And to be impersonal but still point out a societal injustice, I'm not entirely sure, how you do that. Off the top of my head, I'm going, if I walk down the street, there's an elementary school near my house, and they have a mural where it's, I think, like upraised, it's a bunch of handprints, right? And there's a rainbow and there's a bunch of faces, and the faces are all different colors, and it's like, one world or something like that. One world, many faces is what I think it says. I didn't take a picture of it to compare here. I had no idea I was going to mention it. And when you look at that, you go, okay, anyone could have made that. It could have come from anyone of any color at any point during the last 50 years. There is a person who you wouldn't think twice about meeting, on the street. There's a person who wouldn't necessarily identify immediately as something or other, but just feels a general trend towards we should be open and accepting of all types of people. And that is an impersonal artwork, I would say. So that's just me. This is just me thinking out loud. As I work on creating more and more art, how would I create an artwork that does something like that, as opposed to the artwork I generally create now, which is this and poetry, where it's very personal and about me and focused on me. And if you don't agree with me, or you don't empathize with me, or my life doesn't intersect with yours in any particular effective fashion, it won't be effective at all. I will have said a bunch of words not signifying or changing anything, except possibly myself. Okay. As for the rest of the play, it's a girl power flick with a shallow main personage. I mean, Juliet, the main person and who the play is named after, is very much a self-insert for the audience, I would say, which is, something I've seen in manga and video games quite often. She says the right things at the right time, she expresses the right worries, but it's a little abstract. Like, she isn't quite emphasizing her own personal history enough, I feel. Whereas many of the other characters, the minor characters, have a personality and a story and a backstory, which is depicted in the play itself, and therefore has more power. Whereas Juliet's backstory is buried in the play Romeo and Juliet, which I haven't seen since high school. Yeah, so that would be sort of the issue with the play for me, is that it really feels like it was written by a 16-year-old trying to be 20, if that makes sense. I do appreciate some of the bits about Anne Hathaway, because they explain the history. This would be Shakespeare's wife way back when, not the current one, as they take pains to point out, with a few puns here and there, which were enjoyable. right? But they take her history and they explain it in the play, what's going on. And all of a sudden you become invested because the character you're looking at in the play has explained who she is and why she's here. You know, she has a personal piece about her identity. And this personal piece comes out as words. Whereas Juliet's more personal pieces really come out as songs. And these songs are, in many cases, bits I recognize from commercial songs, right? So they're well used, but they're crammed in. And the play isn't quite personal enough. It doesn't get up to the level of quality I really wish for. It's more about the ideas are interesting for the play, but the execution is a little bland. It's a little off. So I wonder, is that part of the play's purpose? To sound like it was written by a 16-year-old trying to be 20? Or is the play's purpose to sort of put Juliet in the background and bring these other characters into the foreground, like these minor characters who are older and grown and know who they are and what they want? Whereas, Juliet sort of ends this whole play going, I want to become who I am. I want to decide. I want to know who I am. I want to have the opportunity to find out for myself who I am. Right? So the play ends on I would say very much an anticlimax. The play ends on an anticlimax. It's just like, oh, and you're up and up and up, and hey, we have a flashy showpiece. It's kind of done. Everybody leaves. Life goes on. Are the characters happy? Did they learn from this? It's unclear. Juliet ends up at one point getting engaged to a kid named something or other. Francois. Yeah. Franco or Francois. And she has to get engaged because her parents are like threatening to put her in a nunnery if she doesn't because she's disgraced them. But then the engagement is broken off and her parents, I don't even remember if her parents reacted. So this entire premise of the show, which began with, oh my God, she's going to be forced into a nunnery, becomes a non-issue at the end because she sang a song. Right? She didn't persuade anybody. She didn't change anything about her life, really. She didn't fight an enemy. She didn't evolve from the beginning of the play to the end of the play. In the very beginning of the play, she's like, I'm going to find out who I am. I'm going to get over Romeo and move on and visit Paris. And at the end of the play, she's like, I'm going to find out who I am. I'm going to find out if I love Romeo, and I'm not going to be tied down, or we're going to test this out. She goes from I'm finding myself to I'm finding myself. Whereas the other characters in the play go from who am I to I know who I am. Or what position I am, and now I'm in a different position. Or what dialogue am I having with my husband, and now I have a different dialogue, in the case of Shakespeare, for example. So is the point of the play sort of to have Juliet be there as the empty spot around which everything moves, right? The point, I mean, the message of Juliet is, give her space to find out who she is because she's only 14. And that's really the message that Juliet is shouting and shouting and shouting to the sky. It's the message that the play tells us over and over again. Hey, let her find out who she is. Don't put her in a box. Don't define her. She's very girl power, okay? But it's also sort of something I haven't seen in a play before, where it's just not quite fulfilling, I would say. I come out of the play feeling frustrated, not energized. But hey, if you're supposed to identify the main character, the main character is supposed to find yourself, then I come out of it going, I guess I'm supposed to find myself too? Great. Okay, who am I? What do I want? Okay, let me start the whole angsty journey again. Right? Because that's what this play and these characters I was watching, are telling me. And I'm going, okay, well, if I'm not really feeling the girl power, if I listen to, I don't know, they have a list of songs here. If I listen to Roar or It's My Life and just go, the feeling I get from this is the same feeling I get from the song itself, and the characters, the situation doesn't add anything. So I feel as if it should add something, and then I'm feeling frustrated because I'm hearing a song I like, but I'm becoming distracted by the situation which the song fits very well in, but not perfectly. Right? I'm not seeing myself in the issue. I'm seeing somebody else's vision and view of the world in the issue. I'm not emotionally connecting with it very well. Although, I mean, I suppose the fact that I'm even talking about it like this says or suggests something different. You know, says or suggests that, hey, the frustration might have an avenue, or maybe you are still finding yourself. You just need to be reminded of that, you know, not to be complacent with your position or who you are and so on. But I don't know, what I find is that, you know, for a sort of a feel good piece, feel good play with a lot of inspiring songs, it is more annoying than inspiring, is the feeling I get from it. And, you know, partially this has to do with Romeo, I think. Romeo, I feel, is unfairly maligned in the play. So a major spoiler here, which was probably the best moment of the entire play, right, is when the revelation comes that Romeo is alive. And Romeo comes out and he's going up to Juliet and he's saying, hey, I love you. It's great. I'm still alive. You're still alive. There was that dying problem, but that's finished. Let's get together. All right, let's go. And Juliet is very hesitant about this. Juliet's like, I don't know. I accepted you as dead and I moved on, and I don't know if I want to go back. And of course, Romeo is standing there going, what do you mean? Like, Romeo's like, I didn't do anything wrong. How did I mess up? And yet somehow you've decided that love is not enough anymore. I mean, we just defied our entire families. And it's like a week or two later, and you're going, nope, it's done, it's over. And you know, Romeo's like, I don't understand what's happened here. And you know, the subtext is they got involved too fast, they moved too fast. You know, Juliet is realizing this, and she wants to take a step back and think about it. But the other subtext is, you know, that she gets engaged to this other guy because she wants to avoid being put in a nunnery. And Romeo comes back, and I'm just like, okay, the answer to all the problems is already here. You're already married to Romeo. Why are you marrying another guy you don't like? Like the situation she's in is absurd given the choices she makes. Or the choice she makes to marry a guy she doesn't love is absurd in face of the situation she's in. Yeah, I think I got it backwards there. Right? Like, what's the point here? That you're leaving the chance for love in order to marry someone just because he was kind of there and his father is pushing him to get married? Like, you know, it's anti Romeo and Juliet, right? It's anti the message of the rest of the play, which is, hey, if you like each other, get together. It is put together, it is put down in the play in such a way that Romeo seems almost villainish at times. You know? And I think there's a definite agreement to be made for, you know, they move too fast, and a definite agreement for Romeo is not the smartest person on the planet, let's say. You know, he's not the sharpest tack, is definitely the feeling you get. and I may probably am, almost certainly am projecting here. You know, given my own love of romantic stories, let's say, where, you know, the message I have drilled into my head is, hey, love's enough, everything else comes after that. If you've got love, everything else can work. You know, if you don't have love, then it doesn't matter what else you got, it's kaput. You know, the whole relationship in the history. And, you know, and the future you have together and whatnot. So when, you know, Romeo is maligned because of his viewpoints, I feel personally offended almost. You know, when choices are made, I'm going, this doesn't make sense that she would act in this way in this specific situation. I get pulled out of it because the point of the play is to send a message again, and it's a very blunt message. It's a message where Romeo himself has no place in the situation. Right? You know, if Romeo was gone and had never been entered into it at all, then the same exact events would have happened, right? Except Juliet would be still moving on without Romeo. Instead, she's gone backwards from where she started in the play. And, you know, and we are reviewing the Romeo and Juliet play again, in a way, with Romeo and Juliet in love at the end. And, you know, having their first date, their first real date, and working it out from there on, which is like, well, why did we even have the play then? You know, you could have just said, hey, they survived, you know, end of Romeo and Juliet, they lived. And would have had the same effect upon the main characters, you know. The parents who were so in the way during the first Romeo and Juliet play, you know, the whole society, that is ignored. You know, Juliet like wants to be emancipated and doesn't want her parents to tell her what to do and wants to be free to pursue her own vision. And I'm going, okay, look, in, I don't know, 15th century Italy, you're going to have problems with that. And I don't mean just societal ones. I mean, how are you going to afford food? How are you going to live? You know, where are you going to go? What's going to happen? You know, all these real world issues that I think about come into play, and the play ignores them, right? The story I'm looking at ignores them, passes them by. And they're important when it wants it to be, right? Oh, she has to go to a nunnery because she's disgraced somebody. But they're unimportant when they don't have to be, right? You know, so-and-so is upset because his gender is whatever. Their gender is identified. And, you know, so-and-so is upset because he thinks his father won't like that he kissed a boy. And the father's like, oh yeah, no worries. I don't care. It's fine as long as you're happy. I'm going, well, that was an artificial conflict. Like we were set up, you know, emotionally set up and prepared for some event to happen and nothing. I'm like, yes, good, great. Everybody turned out fine. But there is a point in the play where Shakespeare says to Anne Hathaway, you know, that the play she's written so far isn't very good. You know, he's like, look, there's no conflict, there's no drama, there's nothing happening. It's just Juliet sort of wandering around, you know, undirected. And you know, the audience isn't engaged. And I agree with this viewpoint completely. All right, the story, the second part of the play was much, much more interesting than the first. And that's not saying much. You know, when I say something like, I give the second half of the play a 7 and the first half of the play a 5 out of 10, it is sort of the bit I'm saying here. You know, none of these are star material. Even if I'm talking about them, I'm not talking about the quality of the play, like, oh, I'm so amazed and it affected me so much. I'm talking about, you know, the execution was so bad that I'm frustrated sort of issue. Like, it was so bad, I couldn't take my eyes off it. It wasn't quite that. You know, I was in the middle of the first act, was like, should I walk out? This is kind of boring. You know, nothing's happening. You know, you need this interaction. You need this build up. You need these events because it's a story and it's not quite real. And so the entire play feels as if it is chock full of ideas, chock full of feelings, chock full of messages, and chock full of way too much. If it had focused more on some of these issues, if they had dropped a few characters, then I think it would have come across as a much stronger play. Like the Lord and the maid, have a liaison, and they have an interaction in a bedroom, which is more characterization for those two than any other character in the play. And that's because they explain themselves, like they're talking to themselves, and they're telling their history to each other, and they're reminding themselves, and they're obviously feeling it, whereas the rest of the characters are sort of telling the audience who they are, which is to my view not a wonderful artistic method. And I'm well aware I'm saying this as someone who's never written a play. Well aware I'm saying this as someone who, if I tried, would immediately fail to overcome the hill. Right? I realize I'm bad. I'm realizing that my criticism here is as a critic, is as a watcher, not as a doer of the same situation. But nevertheless, I have that opinion. And there are reasons for it. I have watched a lot more plays than I have written them. Okay, so there's no discussion of the actual problems in society. It's very much a fairy tale, and not the old complex Galentine one with, witches and heroes and goblins and dragons and swords and elves and fantasy and magic. No, this is more of the modern Disney one, where it's a whole bunch of messaging and the characters aren't quite as real, and issues become glazed over with the power of song and not the power of feelings or the power of will. Right? It's a bit more... I want to say... happy-go-lucky. Like, everything's... Yeah, from the minute this play starts, you're going, okay, everything's going to turn out well because of the songs used and the messages. Juliet's going to go to a nunnery, and I'm like, no, she's not. There's no way. She's getting out of it. So the message is Juliet finding herself, and the play feels like that, like it's trying to find itself. Right? There are lots of feelings in it, lots of ideas, but it's not quite sure how to go about the hard work of actually doing things. It's not sure how to go about the hard work of actually changing the world. It presents itself as a picture of a better world, but it's a half-assed one. There's no roadmap here. It's just, this is how you should act, and very blunt. It's a blunt instrument for a delicate task, I would say. And there are times to use a blunt instrument. But this is not, I feel, the best one. It's a blunt instrument in the way that a plastic bat is, and not a blunt instrument in the way that a wooden or metal bat is. It's too soft for how hard it tries to be, is what the feeling I have. And part of that problem is it pushes an ideology, it pushes a view of the world which has opinions about, gender and society and how people should believe and act and how parents should be, and what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what is good, what is bad, how dialogue should be presented between people. But when doing so, it fails to engage with the ideology of the world outside it, right? It fails to give reasons for why it feels the way it does. It fails to convince the watcher that something important is happening here because of its weak characterization, I would say. That's the main problem with it. It is too many directions. It is trying to go too many directions at once, and this effort is crammed into a small bit. It's 2.5 hours long, and you'd think there'd be a lot you could get done with that time, but there wasn't enough time to do what it needed to do because it had too many ideas and was pushing in too many directions at once. It's not focused, I would say, and it's also not. And I say that not being focused is a problem because it is also not much of a story. The story ends up with the main character pretty much where she was at the beginning, as a person. Yeah, that would be the issue I see with it. It tries to do too much and fails at doing that. So I ended up giving a 6.5 out of 10 overall. I think it may be better as a book. I think it was a book originally, so perhaps I should read that. But as a play, not so great. And part of the other reason I wonder if it is like that is because it uses commercial music, right, which has connotations outside the play itself. It doesn't. The play does not speak for itself. The play speaks in the middle of a greater world. It's like a rock on a path, and not the path itself, is the feeling I have. So yeah, those are my thoughts from watching Anne Juliet. Sometime in the next month or 2 or 3, I'll go watch another poem. Another play, and I'll have some more thoughts on that. I think I'm gonna go see Lion King in January and have something to do about that. But watching this really made me sort of wish to find more unique plays that are not a rip-off of something else. I don't mean rip-off in a horribly bad way, just as in it's very hard to improve upon Shakespeare when the writers of this play are very obviously not Shakespeare. They do not have the subtlety, I feel, to quite engage with the subject matter they are dealing with. And this is probably a horrible insult, but I can see why the reviews may have been middling.